Okay, so welcome to the next video. So let's continue working on the cars route over here. So we'll also have like another route that is going to be like slash, and then we want to provide a cars ID. So let's get started. Let's go router.route. Let's put that route in, so it's going to be car ID like that. And then we will have a bunch of functions over here, but let's get started with a get request. So the get request is supposed to simply return you the car in question. So let's like pretend that there is a function, and let's pretend that it is called get car. We will shortly make it so like this: cars controller get car. Okay, and if I open the cars controller over here, let's create that. So I'm going to create a new function over here, and let's call it get car. Okay, get car is going to be also async, so request response next, and then that function will the sole purpose of this function is to simply get the car in question. So we are going to create a car variable, and let's await the car model. Then let's find by ID using the particular ID, so that ID is going to get stored in request.params.car ID for now, before we do validation. And then let's simply respond back with status of 200, and let's simply pass that car to JSON as a response. So now if I make sure that server is running, it is, and if I open a Postman, and let me change that. Now if I change this to cars, and let's simply use some car ID, let's use this one, and I send this get request, we get the car in question. So that works perfectly. But also, while we are here, let's actually implement the validation here. So we just need to validate a single param. So validate param, and then what we need to do is we need to specify the schema we're going to use for this, and then the name of the parameter. So the schema is going to be just an ID schema, and the name is going to be car ID like that. Now we also need to come to this cars controller and simply change this to request.value.params.car ID. Now let's simply make sure that it again works as it should be. Okay, awesome. So that's done. That was easy. Now let's continue on. So we will have like a put and a patch methods in here. So let's start with the put one first. Let's name that function replace car, similarly to how we call them in here. We call that replace user. So I'm going to say cars controller dot replace car like this. And if I come here, let's create that new function, replace car. It is also going to be async function request response next. Okay, and then what we need to do is, well, let's take a look at how we did it in the users. So if I open this side by side, whenever we need to replace something, we used find by ID and replace, and then we pass the ID, and then we pass a new object that should be replaced. So let's do just that here as well. So we can first of all let's get a handle on that car ID. We can do it like this, but let's do it how we used to do it. So I'm going to encompass this in squirrely braces like this, and then let's also get a handle on that new car body. So const new car, sorry, and that's going to be request.value.body. And while here, let's also think of the validation. So okay, so the validating param is going to be same as this one, And then we also need to validate body as well. So let me write validate body, and then we will need to come up with a schema for that as well. So what I actually thought about is, if you take a look at how we are currently naming this new car schema, I think it would be better actually if we rename this old car schema to like user car schema, and we keep this like just car schema. That makes more sense, maybe because like we had user schema for the user resource, we should have car schema for the cars resource. So I'm going to come here and change this, instead of calling it car schema, to call it user car schema. And this thing over here, which we used in the last video, is going to be simply called car schema. Now, by making those two changes, we need to make some other changes, otherwise it will break. So let me come back to the users resource, and let's see, whenever we used a car schema, we need to replace it. So we didn't use it here, didn't use it here at all, but we started using it here. So we need to change this car schema to user car schema pretty much. And if we come back to the cars resources, we don't want to call it new car schema anymore, but just car schema. And yeah, that's it. So now when it comes to validating the puts, we want to pretty much require all the fields, so we can totally use this one. So let's use it. So we're going to say validate body schemas dot car schema, like that. And now if we return back to here, we should be getting those two values. And then what we need to do is we need to await car.find by ID and update. We need to pass the car ID, and we also need to pass a new car object. But if you think about it, if John is selling a particular car and you want simply to like replace his car, the seller is still going to be John in that case. So actually we don't really need the seller, we don't really want it to be there. So let's actually create a new schema that is going to be for putting. So we can call it like put car schema. I know like that breaks maybe like the naming convention that we use, but now we're coming to this stage where we don't really want to pass the name of the seller, ID of the seller, because we want the seller to stay the same. So let's do it like this. And if I come here and I change this car schema to put car schema like this. So now this should be good to go. Let's simply make another reference to how we did it earlier. So then we can store results of that action here. Okay, so we can store the results in that variable, and then we can return back to client status of 200 JSON, and let's say that the put method was successful indeed. So something like this. Okay, so now if I open a Postman and I go and I see all the cars, let's say I want to change this Toyota one over here, so I basically get that model, that document, and then I want to send a put request there as a JSON. And now let me actually copy this and simply change the year to like 2000, and let me get rid of this that MongoDB automatically puts there for us, and also get rid of these two fields. Now if I send this request, we should see success true, and then if we query for this car once again, we'll see that it is changed. And if we query for this user, it should be in here as well, the new car. So this is working as we want it to work, so we can move on. So the next thing is the patch, which is going to be similar, but you just don't want to like enforce all the parameters for that schema. So let's say dot patch. The end method is going to be called like update car, so cars controller dot update car, like this. But before that we need to validate both param and body. So validate param schemas dot id schema, and it is called car id, and validate body and schemas dot, and we'll need to create it, but let's call it patch car schema. Patch car schema, like that. Okay, so now let's create that schema. So let me just copy the name. If I come here and actually let me paste the name and then copy all of this. So patch car schema is going to be the same, only difference is that none of these properties are going to be required pretty much. So if you take a look at user schema and user optional schema, that is what we're doing here as well, just removing the required fields. So now let's write that new function in the controllers. So let's create a new function called update car. Is also going to be async request response next, and then let's get again all of these like that, and well, we can pretty much copy the entire thing because the only difference is that validation. So now if I save this and I open Postman once again, and let's take a look at some car in particular. Okay, Audi R8 2012. Now if we try to send a patch, actually first of all let's try to send a put request, but let's miss one field to see what happens. Yeah, okay, great. So it is yelling at us that year is missing, so that's awesome. But if we leave the body as is and we use a patch instead and I send it, we see that it worked. And now if I get back to get request, we see that now the car has changed. So let's say we just want to change year to like the latest one, but leave everything else as is. Let's go to the patch, let's get rid of all of these, let's name this year and let's say 2017 and send it. Now if I send get, we should see Toyota, but the year should be 2017. Toyota 2017, so that's great. Now the only method that is left for us to cover is the delete one, so let me do just that. So dot delete, the function is going to be called delete car, so cars controller dot delete car, like this, and we will just need to validate param this time, so no body is going to be sent. So validate param schemas id schema, and the parameter name is car id, like this. Okay, now let's create this function. So over here let's create that function delete car. It's going to be async request response next. Okay, so what do we need to do? We need to remove the car, but we also need to remove that car from the user's array of selling cars. So if you remember over here, user contains a bunch of cars that he or she is currently selling. So what we need to do is to not only remove the car from our car collection, but we also need to remove that car from this array, otherwise that would be like invalid entry. So let's get started. Let's first of all get a reference to a car and get a reference to a seller. To do that, let's create a car and let's simply get a handle on it. So await car.find by ID, And before I do that, let's simply copy this because it also exists in this case. So get a car by its ID, which is this one. Now let me do this step by step. So let me first console.log this car so we can see something. So if I try to delete this car right now, we are just interested in what happens here. So we see that we have access to these fields over here, and one really important for us is this seller ID. So by using that one, we can get a handle on who is the actual seller behind this car. So once we get a handle on the car, let's say const seller ID is equals to car.seller, like this, and then we can get a seller by using the user model and then find by ID and then providing this seller ID over here. So at this point we pretty much get a car, and here we get a seller, like this. So now we have a car and now we have a seller. So what we need to do is to first of all let's simply remove the car. So that's easy. We can say here remove the car, and that's going to be await car dot remove, like this. Now that we have removed the car, let's remove car from the seller's selling list. So how can we do that? Well, similar to how we were able to push things in that list, we can also pull things out of that list. So we can say seller dot selling, again still referencing to this piece of here over here. I just still referencing to this property. I just named it wrongly, so it is actually called cars. So seller dot cars dot pull, not push this time, and then we want to pass this particular car. So we want to remove that car from that array. And of course, if we wanted that change to take place, we need to seller.save, otherwise that's not saved in the database. And after that it's pretty much done. So I can say here status of 200 JSON. I can say success true, like this. So just a quick recap: we get car ID, we find the car in question, we then know that every car has this seller field that is the ID of the seller, so we use that to get a handle on that ID. Then we're able to find the actual seller thanks to that ID. Then we remove the car. Know that after this line we can still access this car over here, so don't think that this is magically disappeared on this 64th line over here. So then we pretty much say to sellers go on, take a look at that list containing all the cars that you sell, and when you find this car in particular, simply remove it from that array. And then we need to save the seller again so that this change takes place, and then we simply return back to the client with success. So let's try this. So first of all, this car should exist. Okay, it does. Now let's call the delete method on it. Okay, it says success true, and now this is the moment of truth, whether this car will now exist or not, and it doesn't exist. So now now the car gets deleted from this list as well, and that's great. Okay, so just one quick change that I had to make. If you what happens if you already deleted some car, let's say this one, I deleted it, and I want to try to delete it again. As you can see, it complains that cannot read seller of null, pretty much like this line over here returns null, and then the dot seller doesn't exist on this object. So we can do something here. We can say if the car doesn't exist, we can respond back to our client with, let's say, 404, and JSON, we can provide some maybe like error, and then say that car doesn't exist, and let's simply escape this. Something like this perhaps. So now if I save this and if I try to delete this once again, you can see that car doesn't exist and it's not complaining anymore. Also another thing, if you take a look at the console, you can see that error can't set headers after they are sent. What that means is once we actually respond back to the client with for a message in this example, it actually tries to do the code below. So what we need to do is to actually return this, like return res.status. Now that won't be an issue anymore. And now let's do like one more example. Let's use this guy over here. So he has 3 cars. Okay, so this is the one. Let's simply delete it. Okay, let's try to delete it again. Car doesn't exist. Let's check the console. No, I just want to... okay, never mind. I just want to see what happens when we try to delete it already, now that we have added that return keyword. So if I try that again, you see that we don't get that can't set headers after the already sent error message. Now if I refresh this list, so he had 3 cars. If I refresh, he has 2 cars. Let's take a look at the second car. Let's delete it. Let's try it again. Okay, and let's send this again, and we can see that one by one we can delete them. And now he doesn't have any more cars left. Okay, so this method is done. This is like the final function, if you need to take a look for the reference. And with that said, our car route is totally done. So now we have finished like all of the requirements that we set to do in the introductory video. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next video.